All right, so starting where we left off, we were here, and I went ahead and made some layers, and I just put these objects within layers. So I'm going to go ahead and start actually finishing this model off. And so I'm going to go ahead and bevel these edges. And this is really simple because we want to bevel all of them. We just select every edge, and we go ahead and just hit bevel. And obviously that's going to be way too much because if we're looking at our reference, it's way too big of a bevel. So let's keep our reference out and let's move our bevel up a little bit like so. And I want it to match it closer, so I'm going to give it an extra segment like so. That's pretty close. That's pretty darn good. All right, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect considering the fact that it's a cut of wood and, you know, none of these bevels are exactly the same. No one will notice the difference. So just hit Q, you can drop that, and then we can go ahead and select the object, and if we want to see what it looks like with soften UVs, we'll just go soften edge, and there we go. That looks really nice. It's quite simple, looks almost just like the reference, and we are a good way there. So now what we want to do with this is we want to lay out some UVs. Say, what are UVs? Well, UVs are a flattened version of basically any of your models. So the old way to get your UVs out would be to hit this icon here, and it'll bring out a UV view. The other way you can do it is go to Windows Modeling UV Editor, bring that up. It's the same thing. But Maya put in these new, or Autodesk I should say, put in these new like screen layouts for different tasks, and I really like this one because this is basically how I work. I want to hide the outliner for now. Okay, so I like to have a 3D view out here and then my UV view right here. And for right now, I don't really need the reference out, so I'm just going to hide it in the layer like so. And I'll close that. And now we just have this. And you can see there is actually UVs on it by default because it was a box. So boxes in any primitive usually has UVs on it. So, you know, if I made a sphere, you would see that there's by default UVs. But of course, we don't want a sphere in the scene right now. But the same thing like with a torus, there's UVs as well. Any of these primitives have UVs. So the box UV for the standard box is correct when it comes in without being touched. But once we start manipulating the aspect ratios of this box, this becomes something that's not correct anymore. Okay. So what we're going to see here is that we have a representation, a flat representation of what's in our 3D view. So if I go ahead and just scroll over any of these things, you can see that they're lighting up. You can just grab a whole bunch of them, grab those, that's on the bottom, and you can see how they light up. These white seams that we're seeing right here, that's just like a toggle basically. It's showing you where you have open UV seams. So when you're looking in the viewport, you can see that's where the open UV seams are. If those bother you and you don't want to see them, you can just turn them off. They don't have to be there. This is your grid for your UV 0 to 1 space or UDIM space. And don't get confused with all the terms, but basically just means that you have a 0 and a 1 in the U, and you have a 0 and a 1 in the V, which kind of coordinates to, like, think about it as like an X and Y Cartesian coordinate system. But basically it's just, you know, you have a bunch of these 0 to 1 spaces that kind of, well, this is the only true 0 to 1 space is this first one. But after that, it would be like a 1 to 2 space and 1 to, or 0 to 1 space. So, but you can lay out different texture sets in each one of these if you wanted to for this box, and do different things with those. But that's more advanced stuff, and we're not really worried about it. For right now, we're just sticking to just this area, but I wanted you to know it's called like the 0 to 1 space. That's, you might hear those terms, and I wanted you to know what those are. So the first thing we're going to do is let's just put on an automatic planar projection, like multi-plane projection. So that's this box thing right here. We have different projection types that we can do, but this box one works perfect for anything that's like a simple box. So we're just going to click on that, and you can see right here, basically what it's done is you see these flat planes in here. It's going based on all of our axes, and it's shooting a projection towards the mesh, and if it hits the mesh by a certain ratio, it basically takes it and lays it out flat in here. So this little square here is projecting out of this little square here is projecting out of this, and it's laying it out here in our UV view. If we go ahead and just reselect it, you can hit Q if you want to drop that tool if it's still up in your viewport. You'll get rid of those projection planes, and now we can look and see what our UVs look like with a checker texture on in there. And what this checker texture does is it helps us just to see if all the UVs are in relation to each other the same proportionate size. So in other words, this square right here and this square right here should be exactly the same size because they are in the 3D space. And if they are the same in the UV space, then that means they basically take up the right amount of texture data, or let's just say a balanced amount of texture data. Same thing with this. Since this should be double the size of this, you can see this is about half of this, then these should all be the same as each other because they're all basically the same. Now, what this relates to is something called texel density, which is basically the amount of texture space per pixel. So basically, we want to make sure that that the texture space we're using is proper for the pixels that we're using, and there's a lot of depth that goes into that. And since this is kind of basic stuff, I'm not going to get into all the depth of texel density, but for beginners reasons, we just want to make sure that our UVs are basically all the same, proportionately the same to each other, okay, which they are at this moment. All right, and you can tell that by just looking at these checkers. But if you hear texel density in the future, don't get scared or anything like that. It's just a subject that's talking about how much texture is used per pixel and stuff like that. So, okay, so these are all laid out in a way that makes them pretty much almost perfectly even. But what we want to do is we want to minimize how many seams we have, and we also want to minimize where those seams are or how much they show up. So in this case, in a box, you don't really have much choice about where the seams show up because kind of like every side could be seen if you go around it, except for maybe the bottom. But we can go ahead and minimize how many seams there are. So we're going to take a few steps to, first of all, actually make the layout even better, and then we're going to stitch the edges together so that the seams are pretty much hidden. So to make the layout better, I'm going to do what's called an unfold. And an unfold is kind of like going to take the surface and make it even closer to this surface. So let me go ahead and hit unfold. And if you were watching closely, you'll notice that the UVs did move a little bit. Let me hit undo. And I'll go ahead and hit unfold again. And they kind of shifted a little bit. And if we go ahead and turn our textures on and then hit it again, you can see there was a tiny bit of a shift. So what that's kind of doing is sort of relaxing the shape closer to this shape. And there's a lot we can learn about doing this with more complex objects. But for this tutorial, we're just going to stick to just clicking it once and getting it where it needs to be because it worked pretty much perfectly the first time. One thing I want to do here is I'm going to use, actually I'm in the wrong one, I'm going to use my Orient Shells. I'm going to click on this. And what that basically did was it straightened these things back out again so that they're straight up and down. All right, let's go to our edges. So if we just right click and hold and go to edge, we just slide up to edge like that. And at this point right here, I'm going to hide these thick edges. So let's just select in the 3D viewport this edge right here. And look what we got here. In our UV, we actually have two edges selected. So why is that? Well, we're actually, you know, selecting both of these edges. So this piece right here, this face, and this face, you know, these are these two faces, and then these two right here. And so this edge is actually shared in the 3D view, and the UV is broken at this point, but we're going to actually want to stitch those back together so that if we're putting textures on here, we won't see any funky seams there. It'll minimize how much texture work we have to do. So we're just going to go ahead and grab these edges, and we can go ahead and go up to cut and sew, and we can just say stitch together. And you can see it just moved it over a little bit, and it stitched those two edges together. Now, these are close enough here that we could probably stitch these together too. But let's take a look at it while we do it and see if we get any major warping. I highly doubt we will, but I'm going to just look at my 3D viewport and see if it looks like it warps too much. Like if these squares get all squiggly, then I won't do that. So I'm going to hit sew, and you can see this one squiggled a little bit, but I don't know if it's that bad. I think we can live with that. So let's just leave that like that. And then we're going to just do the same thing over here. So let's just grab, for this point we can actually just grab right there, hold shift and double click down here. So it'll just grab the edge loop down to the bottom, hit stitch together. There we go. We have finished that part, and then we're going to look at this part. So let's go ahead and grab that, that, and that, and then just hit stitch together. And you can see it flipped that thing over, moved it down there. And now let's go ahead and look at our checkers, and you see how the checkers just continue. The pattern continues as it goes through this. But let's see, here's our seam, right there. So if we turn this off, you can tell, yep, that's where our seam's at, on those outside pieces right there. So let's go ahead and stitch the top and bottom on now. So we can come up here and just hit that, and you can decide which one of these you want to stitch it off of. I would probably use the edge right here, like this one or this one. So let's also go like this too, and select these outer ones and say stitch together. And then we'll do the same thing down. Let's do it right here. So now we have these selected down here. Oops. Hit the wrong button. And then we'll just say stitch together. There we go. Okay, so now it's all good. Let's go to face, double click on this. It'll select everything. And we will go ahead and hit layout. Now layout's going to put it in between the 0 to 1 space and basically fit it perfectly between the 0 in the X and the, oh, it didn't actually do what I expected it to do. Well. All right, so there's a reason why it didn't do that, and that's because it's being limited by this, by these two pieces down here, or above here and down here, that are basically hitting the top and bottom. So if those weren't there, this thing would stretch all the way to here, but it hits those and it stops. Okay, but that's okay, no big deal. We'll turn on our checker, just look at it one more time. Everything looks nice and even, pretty much like perfect, and we can just go ahead and turn that off. And so now this is what the UVs should look like for this object. All right, we deselect it, reselect it, and there you go. Looks beautiful. We have one unit block created. Now the rest of the unit blocks are pretty much a wash, rinse, and repeat of this process. So I'm going to stop here, and in the next step we will look at how to put a texture on this, and we'll be done with this unit block, and we'll move on to the next ones, because the next ones are basically just a slight change from the first one. All right, so let's go ahead and get onto it.